What do you need?
With the official, there you go.
Oh, great. Well, good morning and welcome. Good morning, everyone. My name is David Warm. I'm the Executive Director of the Mid-America Regional Council, and it is my distinct pleasure to sort of welcome all of you and to kind of make a few sort of framing remarks on behalf of this workshop, Making Your Community Work for All Ages. I understand we have a compact but highly experienced and focused gathering this morning. I know many of you in the room, a lot of old friends, even a couple of people I pray for on Sunday morning, Dave. But it usually works the other way around, actually, I think. But it is just great to see such a broad group of interests coming from a number of communities around the metropolitan area. We're privileged this morning to have some elected officials without whose leadership we would not have made the kind of progress we've made in the last year on this initiative. Artie Malliam from Gladstone is here. Artie, there you are. Great, welcome. It's good to have you. I understand Carol Suter may be joining us a little bit later. Charlotte Melson, Raytown Board of Aldermen and Chair of the First Suburbs Coalition, doing a great job in that capacity. Welcome, Charlotte. And Courtney McFadden with the Prairie Village City Council. Great. Courtney, welcome. I also want to extend a special thank you to the funders. This work over the last couple of years would not have been possible without the investment of the Jewish Heritage Foundation. I think Carol Sater's expected. Oh, she just walked in. Welcome, Carol. It's great to have you here. The W.J. Brace Charitable Trust, administered by Bank of America, and the Pfizer Foundation have all invested in this work and made our efforts possible. I think everybody in the room knows the statistics, knows the facts that we hear about now on the nightly news, that baby boomers are turning 65 at a rate of 10,000 a day, and in Kansas City that means 60 a day, which means 1,800 a month or 22,000 every year, and this trend will continue for 17 years. And so we get it, we know it, our communities are changing profoundly, and we are, I think, going about the right thing to develop an appropriate response to that. We've been aided in that process through the vision of the Jewish Heritage Foundation, which began preparing for this shift some 6 years ago with a regional program that was first administered by the Center for Practical Bioethics, and the region, this whole initiative transitioned to Mark a couple of years ago, and we continue to work with the center and many other community partners in this effort. What have we learned in the last 6 years? A lot, but I want to this morning sort of hone in on three lessons that we know about the trends and know about the markets that we're dealing with in each of our communities. And the first of that is that older adults, these baby boomers as well as the generation that precedes them, overwhelmingly prefer to live in community. In neighborhoods that mirror those that they lived in for most of their lives. Members of the 70-year-old generation are waiting much later to move into assisted or retirement kind of facilities, and the 65-year-old plus, the baby boom generation is waiting to in their homes longer. Some are downsizing, but they want options that are part of living in complete communities. The second thing is that in addition to getting older, our communities are changing in profound ways on lots of other fronts. There are fewer families with children, more single-family households, more millennials, more people of color. All of our communities are changing in very profound ways. And unlike previous generations, we have to be thinking much more intentionally, in much more focused ways, in much more deliberate ways, how we plan for, design, create places that meet for these shifting demographic realities. And the third thing that I think is really relevant to this morning is the notion that communities are better off when they can provide an environment for all ages, when we create places that are wonderful to grow up in as well as grow old in. And that's sort of the theme of today's meeting. We know, and we're going to hear later from some speakers, that communities that provide for all ages are more vibrant, they're economically more stable, they're more resilient, they have more mix of services, they provide a higher quality of life for more people. And that is what we're about, is being very intentional with this unmistakable aging reality, a shifting demographic, and trying to respond to and create communities that work for this new reality. And so that is where you come in. A couple of years ago, Kansas City, through the KC Communities for All Aging initiatives, was invited by the Pfizer Foundation and Grantmakers for Aging to be one of just 5 communities across the country in something that was referred to as the Community Agenda Initiative. Communities around the country, in fact around the world, who are sort of ahead of the curve, like I think Kansas City is, have found that embedding municipalities, embedding cities and communities in the middle of that work is an important way to make change and a successful way to make change. Here in our region, we began that work, I think, as most of you know, through the First Suburbs Coalition. The First Suburbs Coalition is a collection of 19 communities who comprise the original suburbs and suburban neighborhoods of greater Kansas City. Most were established and really kind of came into their being in the 50s and 60s. That group has been meeting for some 10 years under the auspices of Mark and is doing really important work on lots of fronts. And they have taken on this agenda as a specific part of their agenda. We're going to see a lot of the results of that work today. The project's been undertaken in a couple of phases. The first was that we worked through the First Suburbs Coalition in developing a toolkit for managing community work for all ages, and how to improve neighborhoods and facilities and other services to meet the needs of a varying population. And that toolkit has proven to be very useful, very successful. And now we're transitioning into a checklist, or the phase 2 of that work, and we're going to be talking a lot about that today and diagnosing that and helping to move that entire agenda along. So what I would leave you with as I turn this over to Kathy to talk a little bit more about where we're going, is just to start where I began. This work is really important, it's relevant, it requires leadership not only from foundation but from municipalities, and it requires us to really understand these core principles, that we are not only getting older, we're getting more diverse, we have to be more intentional, and that we need to create places for all ages in order to meet these new realities. And your leadership, your work in that process is an important part of what we're trying to do in Greater Kansas City. So with that, Kathy, I'm going to welcome, it's Kathy Boyer-Schessel, who's doing marvelous work and leading this entire initiative.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. You bet.
Thank you, David, for setting the stage so wonderfully for this morning's gathering. As David said, my name is Kathy Boyer-Schessel. I'm the project manager for KC Communities for All Ages at MARC. And like David, I also want to thank each of you for being here today, taking the time out to participate in today's workshop. And again, as David said, today's workshop is a culmination of the work that we've been doing for the past, with the pilot work for the last 4 months, feverishly with the past 4 months, but it also started last October. We have a 10-month window for phase 2 with the Pfizer Foundation in partnership with Grantmakers in Aging. At the conclusion of phase 1, the toolkit, as David mentioned, Making Your Communities Work for All Ages, was produced. Many of you in this room actually probably have a copy of the toolkit. We have the executive summaries at the table, so feel free to take one of those with you. The full toolkit is, you can find that on both the KC Communities for All Ages and First Suburbs Coalition's website. You can get a hold of me or Dean if you have difficulty finding that. We can send one to you. When we were invited to apply for Phase 2 funds, members of the First Suburbs Coalition indicated an interest in developing a certification program for cities to achieve the designation as a community for all ages. So this was the goal last November. Actually, it was the goal last August when we put together our grant. We envisioned what our phase 2 work would be with Community Agenda. The plan included the development of a checklist of desired characteristics to be included in this certification program. And 4 communities were chosen to pilot, to be pilot sites to test the checklist in their communities. The goal, again as formulated last fall, was to have a certification program developed and tested and ready to present at today's workshop. Using criteria that's included in the checklist of essential features of age-friendly cities, and you all have the draft copy at your table. This checklist was formulated by using criteria that's been used in hundreds of communities around the United States and other countries. A joint planning committee of First Suburbs Coalition and KC Communities for All Ages developed that initial checklist, which included 8 policy areas and a number of policy and action criteria, which you see in the draft, for each of those pilot areas. And these would be used by communities to assess their current standing on each of these and develop an action plan to meet the criteria to achieve that designation of a certification. The 4 communities chosen to pilot the checklist were Raytown and Gladstone, Missouri, and Mission and Prairie Village, Kansas. Pilot communities began their work last February, just 4 short months ago, and worked feverishly for those 4 months, concluding their work on May 15th. Today's workshop will reveal the learnings that emerged through this journey, this fast-paced rapid transit journey of 4 months, as well as recommendations on how best to continue the momentum to move this important work forward. So before we proceed, though, with what we've learned and where we're going forward, if I can ask Dean Katterndall to come up. We want to recognize and say thank you to the 4 pilot communities who participated in this work. It was an amazing amount of work that these 4 communities did.
Well, first, we'd like to thank the mayors of the 4 communities, Mission, Prairie Village, Gladstone, and Raytown. They really embraced this process, committed their staff to working with us and getting their citizens involved in the process. So I'd like to give a big thanks to Mayor Ron Schaefer of Prairie Village, former Mayor Laura McConwell of Mission, Mayor Gene Moore of Gladstone, and David Bauer, the Mayor of Raytown.
Forgot to push that forward. This effort would not have been successful without a small group of city staff who were designated as their city's, what we called point people, to work with Mark to guide the work in their community. This entailed providing significant and underscore significant guidance to the project design, recruitment of a task force comprised of elected officials, city staff, and residents, and scheduling and making arrangements for ungodly amounts of meetings, and attending planning meetings with Mark's staff and consultants, and providing consistent communication with their individual teams. This work entailed many, many hours, often at night and sometimes on a weekend, and over and above the normal city duties for these city staff. So we'd like to recognize Alan Napoli, Gladstone, if you'd stand. John Benson and Brenda Gustafson from Raytown. Brenda. Martin Riverola, Emily Randall, and Christy Hummerkaus from Mission. And Kate, I know I saw Kate Gunja from Prairie Village.
Finally, we'd like to thank the task forces that worked on this, not only the staff, but elected officials and citizens from these 4 communities that devoted a lot of time. As Kathy said, there were a lot of meetings involved, and really poured over a draft checklist, talking about what's important to their community. They learned a lot about their community in the process. They conveyed this to their elected officials, and then we benefited from their work because the checklist that you have in front of you is really the product of all these meetings and all this work. They met both individually in their various communities, and then a couple times they came all together at MARC, and we spent a couple evenings working on the checklist as well. So I want to thank, and I would ask everybody to stand, all the task force members, including the staffs from Gladstone, Prairie Village, Mission, and Raytown. If you guys would stand if you were on one of the task forces. Thank you very much.
We felt it was important to obtain the perspectives of residents from each of these 4 pilot communities, a check, if you will, to compare residents' thoughts on what is important to be a community for all ages with the information emerging from the task forces. We again thank city staff for recruiting residents of all ages to participate in these focus groups. We know that that was no small feat. One of the learnings we found through this process is when residents are asked to become engaged in an issue they believe to be important for their community, they will come to the table and remain involved. That's certainly the case with task force members, but the focus group people were extremely interested and very engaged in this work. We not only found this with residents who participated in the task force, but when residents who attend focus groups were asked if they wish to remain involved in their community around issues around communities for all ages, nearly 100% said yes and gave their contact information, and hopefully the communities will continue to involve these inspired residents in their continued work. And if you attended one of the focus groups, would you please stand? I don't know that we have any focus group people, but we did want to recognize them if they were here. So please, again, join Dean and I in thanking everyone who participated.
Well, it's now my pleasure to introduce Frank Link. He's our resident economist at MARC, and one of the things we wanted to do was emphasize that sometimes these changing demographics and that are seen as a problem, they're an issue, oh no. But really there are a lot of benefits that are opportunities that come along with these changes. And so Frank's going to talk a little bit about the sort of economic benefits of some of these changes. So with that, I welcome Frank Link.
So this is small enough. If you have questions, just raise your hand and we'll handle it then. So everyone knows that seniors earn a lot less income. That's just, everyone knows that. But they have a lot of wealth to draw on, and they actually spend in a manner that's not too different from the regional average, which is the bar on the far left. Especially and the young elderly spend about $46,000 a year on average. And in essence, they spend about like younger households do. They're not at the prime spending years of the middle-aged households where earnings are highest and you have kids in your home and you got to spend a lot of money and put them through college and all that kind of stuff. But there's a lot of income still when seniors are when you reach seniors old to be spent, either accumulated from the past or current earnings because seniors are working longer. A lot of jobs get created. It is true that they tend to be on the lower end of the pay scale, just like most consumer spending, frankly. But there's also increases in jobs in insurance, financial planning, construction, and legal services, which are not on the low end. So it's not just a matter of creating jobs that pay poorly. There are some good paying jobs being created at the same time. If we look at where spending is increasing by age, most of the other age groups, their average annual expenditures is flat, but for seniors it's actually increasing. So again, reflecting the improving economic conditions of seniors as they're healthier longer and they work longer. And so those are the two groups, the 65 to 74 and 75 and over, where spending is increasing. So they don't spend as much, but their spending is increasing more rapidly than any other age group. and they're wealthier than ever before. So if you look back to 1970, only 18% of seniors were considered high income. Today, that's 31%. There were 15% in poverty back in 1970, but only 9% today. And so you know, seniors are wealthier. They are a buying force, and of course, their numbers are increasing, as David alluded to. And so it really is an economic force to be reckoned with, and it's spending that we don't really want to leave the region when they get old and retire. Not only do they have a lot of the spending power in the region, they also have a large part of the wealth in the region. So here we're looking at the value of the homes owned by seniors, county by county, in the metro as a whole. And they own about a quarter of the housing value in the region. So a substantial amount of the real estate value is owned by seniors 65 and over, and certainly a lot bigger share of the wealth they own than their share of the population, which is the red bar, which is around 12%. So nearly twice their share of the wealth is nearly twice their share of the population. So they're a no slouch group. And then in addition, there's a whole lot of human capital that they have invested in them from prior years of accumulation. So the reds are the 65 and over population, and they do have lower than average educational attainment. The seniors coming up after them, the seniors to be, if you will, the baby boomers that are now retiring, have much higher levels of educational attainment, around 35 to 40%. Of the region's bachelor's degrees are held by the 45 to 64-year-old group. Combined with the 65 plus, they have over half the region's bachelor's degrees. Again, so it's a group that has a lot of knowledge, a lot of experience, and a lot of wealth, financial and educational. Here in Kansas City, we do a good job attracting people from the heartland. This is net migration over the period 2007 to 2011. But you can see that we don't do a very good job attracting outside the heartland. We have net out-migration to many of the Sun Belt areas, especially Texas and Florida, also the coasts. This is only, we don't have this data by age. This is only suggestive, but it suggests that we are, in fact, losing a lot of folks to the Sun Belt, and we suspect that a lot of them are older. This is from our forecasting model, our long-range forecasting model, REMI, and it provides an estimate of retirement migration by age. And the black line at the top, where we're getting net in-migration, that's the 85 and over population. So when people get old, they seem to be moving here. This is the young elderly on the bottom, if I can get it. This is the 65 to 69. So we are losing the young elderly and gaining the old elderly. And I would suggest that that's probably not the value proposition that we want, because it's the young elderly that has more of the income and less of the issues. So we really need to do a better job of figuring this out. How can we retain the people who, as they near retirement age, and not lose them to other parts of the country? And so how we build our communities matters to that. So we've been looking at this a lot at MARC as part of our long-range planning. And here you see in the light green, this is what we called our redevelopment area. It's basically a 1990 urbanized area, which includes the first suburbs and the urban portions of our region. And then the darker greens are the activity centers. These are the commercial areas that have a lot of employment or services. And you can see that they tend to follow transportation corridors. And in fact, we were through our Creating Sustainable Places grant, we looked at six high-capacity transit corridors for additional investment. And they line up pretty nicely with some of our major, although not all of them, activity centers. And those become great places to build the kind of environment that works for all ages, where there's income for the young and the old. They can be served by transit, and create the kind of communities where we can retain folks, because there's lots of fun stuff to see and do, which everyone wants. This is our population forecast, or actually our development forecast, not just population. The reds are where we expect population to decline between 2010 and 2040, so there's still a decline going on in the center part of our region. The blues are where we expect growth, and so most of the growth is still concentrated on the edge of our region. And the greens, which don't show up very well here, are areas that we expect to redevelop. So we're getting more redevelopment than ever before. We are, in fact, rebuilding our first suburbs and center core. But still, the bulk of the development activity is in the ex-urban region. This just shows you where the first suburban redevelopment areas really are. So there is redevelopment occurring within this area, though still some decline. And then this shows you, again, the transit corridors. And unfortunately, a lot of the growth is sort of away from these corridors. It makes it hard to serve. It makes it hard to build communities for all ages in the ex-urban communities. So that's a challenge for us. So another look at it, showing bubbles instead of dots. The blue dots are growth and the red dots are decline, the size of the dot, size of the growth. And again, overlaying the activity centers. So there's a lot of places that can be redeveloped around each one of those activity centers, and a wider mix of housing would go a long way, plus a wider mix of services in those existing activity centers to creating the communities for all ages that we need and desire. But we have work ahead of us. Finally, I want to close with we call these population pyramids. That's because if I were to go back to 1970, it really did look like a pyramid, where a few people at the top, lots of people at the bottom. Here, it looks like the pyramid's, well, it's like a pig in a python. There's a big bump in the middle, and that's the baby boom. And as we run this movie forward in time, you can see the baby boom echo, the millennial generation, and you see that now the generations aren't maybe quite as distinct. So by 2040, it looks more like a stovepipe than a pyramid, frankly. And what we really have is all ages being equally represented. They're all about the same until you get to the very old. And so we have a community of all ages. So we've got to figure out how to build a community for all ages that serves all ages equally well. You can't have a community that's just serving one demographic anymore, because that's not the way we're going to be. We're going to have all ages everywhere. So that's the challenge. That's what you're doing, and I congratulate you on your effort. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. One of the lessons that we learned with the 4 pilot communities, but really other people will ask as well, is why should we do this as a community? What's the return on our investment if we get involved in a certification or recognition or up our game to invest city staff, possibly finances? What's the return? So we really appreciate that Frank provided a little bit of a window into the economic investment in communities for all ages. And thank you so much, Frank, because that really set that up very nice. Also wanted to mention before I forget, we will put these slides on our website. So if any of you are frantically taking notes, you can stop and enjoy and listen. And we're also taping this, so we'll see how that goes as well. We'll send an email so that you'll know when it's up on the website. To move this along, I want to introduce the facilitators that worked closely with the first suburbs so that we can let you know what all occurred during the last 4 months. To assist the First Suburbs Coalition and Casey Communities for All Ages with Phase 2, Mark contracted with the Lewis Berger consulting firm to facilitate the work with the 4 pilot communities. Lewis Berger is a worldwide planning, engineering, consulting firm and has had a Casey-based facility or office since 2007. It's my pleasure to introduce Julie McLaughlin, but I also want to give a shout out to Kelly Reinhardt, her partner, is here as well. But Julie, if you want to come up, who along with her colleague Kelly worked closely with the 4 pilot communities from February through May, although they're still working with us, to test drive this checklist and then to incorporate the feedback into the version that's in front of you today. Julie will provide an overview of the lessons learned through the pilot community experience and present an overview of the checklist. Oops, went too many.
Good morning, everyone. Want to say a special hello to the task force members and the points of contact from the different cities. As those of you who worked with this project over the last 4 months know, Kelly Reinhardt and I were the dynamic duo. Kelly has moved on to another opportunity now, but I'm glad she's here with us this morning because, as you know, if I would get stuck, Kelly was usually the one that could pull me out in terms of if the word wouldn't come to me or something was missing, she was the other half of the equation. So what I want to do for the next little bit of time here is talk with you both about what the checklist looks like now, as well as to talk with you some about the lessons that we learned as we went through this process. And I'm going to try to stay focused on the checklist and not talk so much about what's going to come next, because that's what Dean's going to address. So I may have to rein myself back in here on occasion because it's hard for me sometimes to separate the process and the content from one another in the discussion. We wanted to share with you the roadmap that we developed for this project, not because I'm going to go through this in a great amount of detail, but you've heard several of the speakers, you've heard Kathy and David Warm allude to the huge commitment that was made by the cities and by the volunteers that worked with us on this project. And I think the roadmap really illustrates how much time and effort was put in by so many people in a very short period of time. We first met with the task force members on a cold February evening. We were gratified by the turnout that night. We really didn't know how many people would be able to make it on a weeknight. It was cold, it was dark, and we were just getting started. And we had almost 40 task force members show up that evening to participate. Then our second assumption was, because Kelly and I knew we had to schedule all these meetings in very rapid succession, we were sort of assuming that it would take maybe a couple of weeks or so to put these meetings together. But when it came time to ask people about their availability to schedule these meetings, people started pulling out their calendars on the spot, and we walked out that night with the first round of meetings scheduled. So right from the get-go, we had a strong sense that there was a really big appetite for this work, and that was very exciting to us as we moved through that. As I said, it was a very, very short time frame. We had some very long meetings with people. I know some of the task force were meeting outside of the time that we had scheduled with them one another. People were, I think, fueled by several things. One, they were interested in the topic and they were anxious to share their views and to tell us how they saw things in relation to the checklist. We were also grateful. Most of the cities all supplied light meals, different types of refreshments, and then our contribution was the M&Ms and the pretzels. So we joke sometimes among ourselves that this was a project that was run on M&Ms and pretzels. What I would like to do now is turn your attention to the checklist. As Kathy mentioned, you have copies of that at each of your places, and I'd also like to draw your attention to the executive summary for the toolkit for cities. And because this is a new document and you all are just now having the opportunity to pick it up, I'm going to give you what we jokingly call as facilitators a magical minute just to look at it very quickly. And then I'm going to walk through that document with you to show you where the document stands now. For those of you who've seen it for the first time, of course, you will not have that sense of change that the task forces and the city staff, our points of contact, have. But just take a few seconds, pick it up, kind of thumb through it, get a sense of what the different categories are, and in just a few seconds, I'm going to give you a guided tour through the way the checklist looks now. So as you look at the checklist, you will notice that the cover page starts out with some background information, provides some data, provides some information about trends, and begins to set the frame for a conversation that can be held around this checklist. Then as you move on to the third page, there's a new section. For those of you who saw the checklist in its original form, we've added a new section on tips for how you might use the checklist to have a conversation in your city. And I'm not going to talk about that because Dean's going to address that, but I want to draw your attention to that new content. And then if you move on to page 6, you will see on there and through subsequent pages the areas of content that are addressed in the checklist. And I'm going to talk about those here in just a moment. In terms of the refinements, for those of you who saw the original checklist, we started off with 8 categories. And based on the very consistent feedback that we got from the different communities that we were working with, we have compressed those now into 6 categories of content, which you can see there. Another change, it's not a huge change, but I suspect that it will continue to evolve. We originally had 60 separate policies and actions that cities were invited to assess themselves against, and we've worked to pare that down. It's now at 51. You'll notice as you look at these categories of information that these are very parallel, most of them are very parallel to the types of functions or operations that municipalities are charged with on a daily basis. Public spaces, and by that we mean parks, shared green space, the type of work that may be done in relationship to development that will be shared by all members of the community, for example. Well, retail's more in the second bullet, or third. Second bullet is transportation and mobility. That includes, obviously, the traditional function of public works, but increasingly, the municipalities and cities are looking at various issues related to public transportation and other types of transportation options to meet the various needs of all ages in their communities. The third bullet relates to housing and commercial development. Again, this is a municipal function in terms of dealing with land use and codes and zoning and those types of things. The fourth category, social inclusion, communication, and participation, is sort of the mirror of civic participation. Obviously, cities have a commitment and an interest in civic participation, as well as being able to provide services in those communities. But at the same time, increasingly, cities are looking at the types of social services that may be present or available in that community, because this is where the opportunity to partner with other organizations in the community, nonprofit organizations, faith communities, other types of service agencies are increasingly important as cities look at meeting the needs of all ages. And then finally, the last category relates to community and health services. And again, this is depending on the size of your city. Now, we were working with the first suburbs, and so most of these cities historically have not had, to my knowledge, direct responsibility, for example, for public health, although there are some of the cities in the first suburbs who do have their own public health departments. And likewise, the community service component is typically provided by other types of organizations, but that was one of the interesting findings that came out of this work as the task force sat together at the table and considered the various items that are here in the checklist. It was interesting to listen to cities become more and more aware of the variety of partners that are available to them in terms of meeting the needs of all of their residents, regardless of their age. And likewise, we heard partners talk about their growing understanding of how they can be a significant contributor to the work that the municipality is doing. So it was interesting, as we were at the table, we could see people beginning to connect the dots, maybe in a different way than they might have, say, 20 or 30 years ago, based on the changes in circumstances. A couple of things I also want to make comment about in terms of the checklist. For those of you who are seeing it for the first time, it may seem a little daunting to look at 6 categories and 51 policies and actions. And the intention for the checklist is for it to be as comprehensive as possible. It's quite probable that we didn't hit every single thing that should be considered to be a community for all ages, but the intention is to make it as broad as possible, because at this stage it's intended to be a tool for thinking, to encourage communities to look at themselves, think about where they're going, think about the kinds of services and amenities that will be helpful for their citizens, as well as meet the needs of all ages and abilities within their community. And so it's more of a conversational tool. There's no expectation that a community is going to pick up this checklist and be able to say, yes, we do every single one of these things. It's great if you can, but I think, again, you're going to probably hear us use the metaphor several times that it's the proverbial journey, not a destination. Many of the activities that are identified as policies and actions are things that, for example, you may have adopted a policy, you may have adopted an ordinance or a particular type of plan that codifies the city's commitment to a certain type of action or initiative, but that changes over time. As that policy becomes implemented through action, programs change. And so as you look at the length of that list, don't be intimidated by that. At this point, it's intended to be a conversation starter and just to stimulate your thinking about all the things that might be possible to do. And I just touched on that. They're categorized into two. There's policies, as I mentioned. Those are and as we thought about policy, it's the way cities make a firm commitment through an ordinance, through the adoption of a particular type of plan, or some other formalized commitment to an initiative or an action. And then actions tended to be, we thought, more in the context of actual implementation through programs or activities or other day-to-day activities. So that is how the checklist looks at this point in time. Obviously, we're not going to go through this item by item right now. I don't think you'd want to sit here that long to do that, and we hope that you will look at it in the comfort of your own home and at your own leisure. I would really encourage you, Kathy made reference to the fact that you've got at your tables the executive summary for the toolkit, and if you go online to the Kansas City Communities for All Ages, you will find the full version of the toolkit. These are really meant to be used together. And so I would really encourage you to take the time to pull down the toolkit because it is a tremendous resource, provides lots and lots of information, both regionally as well as nationally, and can point you to other kinds of resources if you're particularly interested in a topic and really want to delve into it into some detail. So keep in mind that the checklist is meant to be used with the toolkit. I want to talk with you just briefly about some of the lessons that we learned as we went through this process. I'm not going to cover all the lessons that we learned because Kelly and I and Kathy and Dean and Marlene, really, the more we worked on this, the more ideas that we had, the more things we thought were interesting, the more things we wanted to pursue. And as we thought about those things, it would make us think about the work we've done with the task forces and say, oh, that's how that gets connected. But I want to highlight some of these major points for you all. One of the messages that came through loud and clear right off the bat from the task forces was to use all ages and abilities language. And I think, that last slide that Frank showed is the data, if you will, for why it should be all ages language. Because as we move forward throughout the century, we move towards 2040, the distribution of population is going to look more like a stovepipe than the pyramid we used to be familiar with. And so I think there's the argument right there for why the language in this checklist and the toolkit, and as communities think about these ages, need to be aimed for all ages and abilities. Another thing that came forward very quickly was in the context of the checklist, it was important for us to try to be more clear about what policies or actions are suggested as being solely the responsibility of the city based on their municipal functions and duties, and what can be accomplished jointly with partners. Now, this is a moving line. This is going to be different in every community. As Kathy said at one point, if you've seen one city, you've seen one city. In some sense, that second bullet it will be defined differently in every city and community, but it will be a part of the conversation in terms of understanding who's responsible for what. The way cities probably thought about themselves 20 years ago, I'm going to guess because I wasn't working with cities 20 years ago, is probably beginning to change fairly substantially for a number of reasons. So this will be an area of conversation if you choose to use the checklist in your community, and you'll be right on target. As one of the middle school counselors, I used to say, if you see your family in the funny papers, you're right on target. I think if you find yourself having this conversation when you use the checklist, you're right on target. You need to be having that discussion. I think another thing that we learned is that there are laws that set, as I would say, the floor for certain kinds of services or amenities in a city. For example, the Americans with Disabilities Act provides very specific guidance on things related to public buildings and parking spaces and things along that line. So the question then that was asked of us by task force members, well then what's a best practice? I mean, if we're doing what's required, what is this best practice thing? And again, this is something I think that's going to be variable, but the reason we believe it's important, again, for cities to have this conversation is that while, for example, a community might meet the legal minimum, it might not be optimal in terms of the type of citizen experience or the quality of life that they want to provide in their community. And I think a great example of this is, many grocery store parking lots now, you will have the traditional ADA, handicapped accessible parking spot that's been set aside, but it's pretty common now to see additional slots as well. We've seen them for moms to be, we see them now for senior citizens. So again, while the law may establish a minimum, I think the conversation that cities will want to have is, what do we want to be for our citizens to make this community as comfortable for them as possible and to maximize their enjoyment of living here? Another thing that became was important, and we were able to provide some of that information because of the work that Mark was doing on this project, and some of the information will be in the workbook as well, or the toolkit. It's important that people have current data and trends when they have these conversations. And when I talk about current data and trends, it includes everything from understanding the demographics in your city. And we would observe probably it's helpful for people to understand the demographics in the region more broadly, not just within their own city or within their own county, because I think sometimes people are concerned as they look at their own data that if they act on that data, somehow another community is going to be working with a very different set of numbers. For example, if people are concerned about, every community talked about the importance of attracting young families. As a citizen, I may think about this differently. If I think I'm the only city that's looking to attract young families and trying to deal with an aging population. But if I put that in a broader context and understand it's not just my city, it's every city in the county, it's all the cities in the region, everybody is being challenged by these changing demographics as well, I think it creates a different conversation. Information about housing, household formation, the numbers of people in households, information about transportation options and transit, that information, again, is changing fairly rapidly, and that's an important component of people being able to have a good conversation with the checklist. You want to be sure you have multiple perspectives at the table, and the cities did a great job of pulling in different ages. You want to have different cultural perspectives at the table, because people will look at these issues from a different angle, and it's important to have all those different points of view at the table. It'll make for a better conversation, and it's likely to stimulate a broader range of thinking as well. One of the things we also discovered, I think Kathy touched on the idea. Originally, we thought we were going to be moving towards a certification process. And to do a certification process, typically you need to have some metrics, which then translate into standards by which an applying city could measure themselves against. Some of the items in the checklist, as you look at them, will lend themselves to metrics. Some of them were not there yet. So this is an area that we will continue to monitor and think about. And as you have those conversations with yourselves in the cities, it's something you will want to be thinking about as well. And finally, it is that piece, assessment leads to a different conversation. This is really, another metaphor I like is the idea of peeling the onion. This is, when you start this conversation, you will start to peel the onion. You think you will know one thing about your city, but as you have the conversation and you bring in more information, it will make you ask more questions. And as you ask that second round of questions, you peel the onion once more. And you keep moving, and the understanding that people have begins to change as they go through that. And so along with that, the thing we would recommend to cities who want to use the checklist is to be sure that you allow time for the conversation. Some of the cities met twice, some of the cities met as many as 4 or 5 times, and I hesitate to tell those of you who haven't been in these kinds of meetings, we actually had some 4-hour meetings, hence the need for pretzels and M&Ms. They don't have to be structured like exactly the way we did them, but you want to be sure that you allow time for people to engage with the content, think about it, go away, talk to their families, talk to their neighbors, come back again, because that allows that conversation to develop over time. There were topics that people discussed recurringly because they tied to those functional areas, public spaces, transportation, housing, all those areas. And again, this relates to the type of information that you're going to want to have at the table. As we touched on, what we know about our demographic situation is changing fairly rapidly, and the people who come to these conversations may have more or less information about that. It's a way of helping people have the same sets of information, and it helps frame that conversation in an accurate assessment of the reality that we're all engaging with right now. Likewise for housing trends, interesting conversations around universal design. This is an area that I really didn't know very much about. You may also see the term used, visitability. It occurred to us as we were listening to conversations that universal design is probably one of those concepts that has a moderate amount of stereotyping around it. The way universal design looked 10 years ago, I think looks pretty different than what it does now. And somebody made the point in one of our meetings that universal design that's added in to a facility or a house looks very different than universal design that's been built in from the beginning. So what the takeaway from that is that is a concept that if you're having these kinds of discussions, you may want to bring in additional information or people who know more about that so people have a broader perspective on what that means precisely. Another area for lots of discussion was density and intensity, and that's straight out of one of the focus groups that I sat in on. Almost everybody talked about the issue of density, and that's historically a fairly sensitive issue in the suburbs. And again, it's one of those concepts that means a lot of things. It meant something different, I think, maybe 40 or even 30, 20 years ago than it may mean now as our region and other communities look increasingly at things like mass transit, or we're looking at managing aging infrastructure. Density is again, it's an area that people are going to have very different viewpoints about, and whatever those conversations may be will probably benefit from the addition of additional information, probably through city staff and possibly from other resources, about the different ways people can think about housing density and the different ways to think about intensity. One of the focus group members he was talking about the tear down and rebuild phenomena that's going on in many of the first suburbs right now, and whether it's technically an accurate term or not, it really stuck with me. He used intensity to refer to those circumstances where somebody takes down a small suburban home and then builds a much bigger home on that, builds that almost to the border. Now, obviously, there's lots of, there's other zoning and code issues that go along with that, but I thought it was an interesting contrast. He said that's not an example of density, it's an example of more intense housing, but you don't get more density out of it. So something to think about. Connectivity. When you hear that, how many of you hear that term connectivity in these kinds of discussions? Are you familiar with the term connectivity? Some of you may be, some of you may not. I have to admit that I went to Wikipedia yesterday just to kind of confirm what I thought I understood about connectivity. And the way I'm understanding it, I've thought about it primarily in the context of transportation, but it really is it's the way that people in a community can get from one point to another. And so it touches on both transportation, terms of roads and transit and the ways people get around, as well as how the environment is built. And so again, this is an area that's will come up in these discussions. People may not have that specific kind of language, but I think this reinforces the importance of having city staff or other people at the table, or using the resources that are referenced in the toolkit to provide people with the content to enable them to talk about these ideas. And then obviously transportation. Everybody's talking about transportation, whether you live someplace in Kansas City where you're talking about the streetcar, or you're talking about the highway tax. Obviously transportation is really important. And interestingly enough, one of our points of, one of our task force members made a comment as we were wrapping up our task force meetings that he was aware before how important transportation was to these issues, but the more the conversation had gone on, the more and more he understood it as being a particularly critical component. So these are the kinds of topics you will be discussing if you choose to use the checklist. Now, I want to talk just briefly about some comparison between the baby boomer demographic, which is, as we discussed earlier, rapidly turning 65, and the interests and needs of young adults. As the project progressed, it became increasingly apparent to us that the interests between these two groups actually converge. I wasn't quite sure, I don't know that I understood that at the beginning, but the more we did reading in relationship to the project and the more we sat in on conversations, sat in on some webinars, it became increasingly apparent, and there's been some writing in the Kansas City Star and in the Business Journal in the last couple of months about the types of things that are of interest to millennials and attracting young adults to the community. Those things that young adults and millennials are looking for in a community are very parallel to what the boomers are saying that they want in their community as they age. Affordable housing is an important thing to both groups. Both groups are interested in low-maintenance housing for different reasons. You know, my husband's getting really tired of cutting the grass like you do when you've been cutting the grass for 40 years. But I think probably for younger adults and for other young families, they are interested in having homes that don't require as much maintenance so they can do other kinds of things with their family rather than spending the weekend cutting the grass. Walkability to shops, entertainment, mixed-use development, shared green space, and transportation options, less car-centric. Again, I'm reflecting on a comment that one of our task force members made. He made the interesting remark that, you know, in the first suburbs, having a house with a single car garage is considered to be a challenge when you go to sell your home. But, you know, maybe in another 10 years or so, depending on what happens with transportation options, having a one-car garage might be just exactly what people need because maybe families won't be having 2 and 3 and 4 cars. Kind of hard to imagine at this point in time, but I thought it was an interesting perspective in terms of sort of reframing the way to look at that single-car garage. So, one more comment about this. The other thing that I think is really interesting is I looked at this content and was doing some reading. These elements combine to, when these things are in place in a way that people find useful and that support the kinds of lifestyles and the way they want to live, both boomers and young adults identify as important to them the ability to connect to their neighbors and the ability to make a difference. And again, in one of the task force meetings, I heard a task force member talk about connectivity in the context of neighbors and relationships in one of the best ways I'd ever heard before. And it made that connection to me in a very concrete way. So when people have this ability to have these kinds of things, it tends to foster stronger communities through making it possible for people to have relationships. It's not so hard to establish those. And secondarily, it makes it possible for people to have the time and to make a difference. And again, I'd like to, I thought Frank's slide about the number, where the bachelor's degrees are held currently in our region, when you think about, so if half of those degrees are in this cohort of people that are about to retire, there's a tremendous amount of human and social capital there that is going to be potentially available to be used in a very different way in the community than has been before. And that's very much parallel to what young people are saying about their lives as well. They want to make a difference. So these things taken as a whole create that kind of opportunity. I would like to invite Dean to come to the podium now, and Dean is going to talk about the process side of this, what we thought was going to happen and where we've wound up with the idea of having some sort of recognition program.
Stuff. So I want to talk a little bit about using the checklist. And I think in the end, this phase 2, we wanted to produce something that would be useful to you to help you create better communities, because that's what you were all about. And so I really want to emphasize that as we go forward. When we went into this phase, we had some ideas, maybe a little too big ideas, about creating a certification program, and that, well, that proves to be quite difficult, and I'll say a little bit something about it. But in the end, we came out with, I think, a very useful tool, very connected to the toolkit that was produced in phase one, that will help you in your community, no matter what we do on a kind of regional scale, help you look at your community in a little different way, a little more focused way around how does this affect different generations within the community. So there's three ways we've kind of thought about using the checklist. One is kind of an informal recognition program where the first suburbs or some organization would recognize accomplishments. A second one is a more formal certification program. Some of you may be familiar with like Tree Cities, and you're certified a Tree City, and you get to put an emblem up at the front of your, as you go into the city, and that's a little more formal. And then the third way is just using the checklist. So I just want to go through these in real quick succession. So the first is a recognition program, and we kind of envision it as sort of 3 steps. It wouldn't be really strongly formal, but there would be, the first step is sort of building awareness in your community, what the issues are, why this is a good way to look at my community, and we would recognize that you've taken some steps to do that. The second is assessing your community's policy. So we've decided that Communities for All Ages is an important way to go. The community's kind of on board with this, so then we walk through, and that's what a lot of our task forces really did during the last few months. You walk through your programs and policies in your community, and how does that match up with that, and should we maybe consider making some changes? And then the third phase would be actually putting some kind of Community for All Ages plan in place so you can move forward. And so this recognition program would be, as I said, sort of informal, not to the level of a certification, but something we could do. And so the First Suburbs Planning Work Group is going to consider this. They're going to take the checklist and look at what would be some very rudimentary, if you would, checkpoints that we could set up a recognition program, and then we'll present this to our First Suburb Coalition meeting, which occurs in early September. And so we'll consider, the First Suburbs Coalition will consider maybe adopting a recognition program. The second phase, as I said, is a little more formal, and that's to actually have a formal certification. And that was kind of part of the goal of this phase 2, but as we got into it, and especially as the task forces got into it, they realized that this is a little more complicated than you might think. And so there's a number of issues that have to be dealt with. So first of all, you have to come up with very specific criteria. So and define those, and what things have to be done, what things maybe could be done. You could get bonus points. So it gets more complicated. You have to, how do you maintain the certificate? Great, you got it today. What are you doing to keep the certification going forward? An important question is, why would a city participate? What do you get out of it from going through the process of the certification that may take some time and resources to do this? Who's the organization that has the resources and has the legitimacy to convey to you this certification? So what? The First Suburbs Coalition or Mark or whoever would do this would convey this on you. Do they have some legitimacy in this field? And also, do they have the resources to maintain such a program? How do you maintain it? What kind of assistance can you provide to local governments? So it seemed like a little bigger program than we had originally anticipated, and so that's A future phase, we're in the process, we're hoping to have, as Kathy's mentioned, a third phase of these grants from the, like Pfizer and that. And this would be one of the things that we would do during that phase is strongly consider this certification program. So, that being said, there's still, the checklist is still a really useful tool. And so, as was mentioned before, in the first few pages of the checklist, there are some ideas for how you can just take the checklist today and start using it in your community. And so they really revolve around three aspects. One is, and this is something that came out of all the task force, we became aware of it, is you have to build awareness. You can't just walk in and start doing this. You have to talk to people, maybe make presentations like Frank did of why this multi-generational view of communities is important, an important lens to put onto your community. And so you have to take some time. And this checklist in the front part has some ideas of how you as a community can go about building that awareness. The second thing is to actually do some planning around this. Once there's support for this way of looking at your community, putting plans and policies in place, you can either have a separate sort of community for all ages plan for your community, but also one way to do it is just to incorporate this lens into your normal planning, whether you're putting together a comprehensive plan or a strategic plan for your community. Maybe you're doing a park plan, so at least you want to think about your park planning in these terms. So, for example, Gladstone is about to redo their strategic plan, which I think is about 10 years old now. And so they're going to use Communities for All Ages as a lens through which they're going to update their strategic plan. So it's a way of looking, are we addressing the needs of all the different groups within our community that have some different needs? And then the third thing is, once you're into this, is some kind of assessment process where you routinely look at what your community's doing, how things may have changed demographically in the community, and are you keeping sort of up to speed on what's going on and continuing to do that. And I want to just re-emphasize something that Julie mentioned is that the checklist is very broad. It's a broad way to look at your community, of looking at how all the services and policies you have affect different generations. And so they're not barriers, they're encouraging to build the kind of community you want. But it's also very flexible, so you can focus on those aspects that are really important to your community, which may be different from one community to another. So, and then I do want to point out one other thing on this matter of use is we will have, I think we've talked about August, right, Laura, a workbook to go along with the checklist. So you could download that and start to check things off or write notes or that. We felt this was a lot cleaner way to present it today, but there'll be a more a working copy of it that you can use as well in the next couple months. So I think with that, I want to ask Julie and Kathy to come back up, and we're just open for questions, discussions about the checklist, about using the checklist, anything like that. Sure.
There's been, I'm sure, a fair amount of work nationally. We're not the only city that's, creating checklists and evaluating these things. Was there any analysis done on anybody else that's doing it, and whether maybe there's an effort at some other community or nationally to create a certification program? Because I think there was a sense of the advisory board that the power of the certification and the value of it is to be able to publicly display it and perhaps attract additional residents, et cetera,
right.
from the value props that Frank put out there. So are there any other efforts along these lines?
I'm going to defer to Kathy on this, but I think our investigation is this is pretty new territory in this field.
With the Pfizer grant, we had the added capacity of having technical assistance from the International Federation on Aging, and then the age-friendly communities that's here in Kansas, or here in the country. So we did do some fairly extensive research on a certification. We found no country, no city that has a certification. There is a model, the age-friendly city model, that's kind of similar to what we're recommending with the recommendation or the recognition program, where cities actually apply for participation in the network of age-friendly cities. But Rob, to answer your question, and Rob is the co-chair of KC for Aging, or KC Communities for All Ages Advisory Board that he referenced, the advisory board. This was really groundbreaking work here to take on a certification. I always felt like there was a reason there wasn't a certification. As Dean brought out, it's much more complex than what we thought.
Could I add an element to that, Kathy?
Does the age-friendly cities group coalition, whatever, meet your legitimacy and capacity?
Yes, yes. Any city who, in our region, who would like to apply to be a part of the age-friendly network would be out well on their way with this, with the checklist. And
Just wondering about partnering with somebody like that rather than trying to take a certification program on board.
those discussions are happening, Rob, at the national level with national organizations where it might be a better fit for them to take this on.
And I think they're kind of interested in what we're doing.
Yes, yeah.
As a part of that.
I want to add one element to that. I mean, I think some of the conversation we fell into early on was, how is certification defined? And the traditional understanding of certification, as I mentioned earlier, is that there's some sort of agreed upon metrics or measurable things that should be done, that there's widespread acceptance of those, and then there is the body that would accept that. One of the things we discovered fairly quickly as we were beginning to work with the particular elements, how these different policies and actions are measured is one issue. Then determining what's considered threshold for a minimum standard is another layer of the conversation. And the other thing that we discovered, and again, it may have been a function because we were still really very much at a pilot stage, is that it's sometimes really kind of hard to decide, really, is something, people could usually agree pretty clearly, no, we haven't started this activity. But when it came to the question, is this activity completed or is it only partially completed, it was kind of a moving line, and some of that was because we didn't have agreed upon metrics with particular measures. And so that's a really significant piece of work that is yet to be done, is to make some sort of determination. If you're community for all ages, so what % of this or that thing should be at X, Y, or Z level? And so that's a piece that's going to take some substantial work.
Any other questions, things you'd like to bring up? Sure. Mary? Yeah, I think we started out with the toolkit as a kind of a guide, and then there's an international checklist. And I think we started with 8 at the beginning of this process, and then through the meetings with the different task forces and that, it was culled down to 6. And so that's how we got to it's not as long as it used to be. That's the bottom line, but still pretty comprehensive. That's how they got there, though. Other questions? Yeah.
I was real excited when I heard about this. Downloading all of the things from the internet, including the entire checklist, 16.
At one point, it was that long.
Read through all of it and was real excited about the possibility, since I'm kind of on the cusp of reaching the age.
That's good. I'm going to start referring to myself on the cusp.
Having been through, one big concern that I had, I noticed was missing
Right.
in that age that are susceptible to heart disease. These people also have a higher incidence of COPD and asthma, which can be affected. Every one of these 6 areas actually is impacted with either smoking or third-hand smoking.
Right.
Baytown is a city that I've been working with for some time to try and get them to go smoke. The mayor is very, very supportive and has about 2 councils. They do not allow smoking in Baytown City Hall, but they refuse to expand that to include the rest of the community. There are 2 sit-downs. At this point, we really are concerned because most of the cities in the Missouri side are smoke-free. But there are several that are not. Baytown being one of them. Riverside and Sugar Creek. They did a survey in Baytown about 6 or 7 years ago, which the city has refused to release, but we know that about 70% of people in Baytown would like to have smoke-free policy. Housing, I think all multi-unit housing should be smoke-free. Because almost all of them have a single average unit, and whatever somebody, if somebody's smoking in one apartment, people in another apartment is smoking because they smoke in another. Kansas City, Kansas City is just addressing that now. Transportation, it would be really nice to be able to get on buses and taxis, and not worry about somebody else smoking. Even if it's just a matter of the nuisance aspect. In Independence, they brag about putting in heaters in the outside bus shelters. And unfortunately, that also disenfranchises the people who don't want to be around people who smoke. Because they have to be people that social inclusion. Why would you want to exclude citizens who cannot be around tobacco smoke from so many areas that I mentioned? I certainly think civic participation again. If people are asking to volunteer in places where they could be around smoke, then this is my job to say. I have to volunteer in my city in 3 different areas. I enjoy it tremendously. I appreciate it. But there will be some areas that we didn't have a smoke-free area law, and I was excluded. Community and health services, when you say, there's nothing new in there about having tobacco cessation classes for people who like to quit smoking. And I think it's really important too. Basically, I'm sorry, it's a scholarship, but I'm passionate.
I can tell that.
What you will hear from the cities, from the citizens in some of these cities that are business owners, they're going to say, oh, we're going to lose money, we're going to go out of business, the city's going to lose revenue. Not true. By every measure that they've had, that has not been true. The tax rate stays the same, and you can judge whether they are in trouble or not by the amount of tax. I propose that if you're going to offer certification or even recognition for these cities, that you insist that they have a comprehensive clean air ordinance before they can be recognized, or before they can be certified. It involves all these areas, it involves all of the citizens, it involves the grandchildren who come to visit these old people in the places too. They go out to visit. Why should they be excluded? A comprehensive, smoke-free, clean air ordinance will include restaurants, public buildings, bars, social clubs, casinos, retail establishments, offices, parks, hotel rooms, child care facilities, and cars with children. really impressive. And I hope that you at least take this into consideration.
I think we can commit to do that. This is still sort of a draft that's going to be going to the First Suburb Coalition in September for their consideration to sort of adopt as a official policy. So we can, as we go forward, we can consider adding the smoke-free policies to the list of things that communities should consider as they go forward. And I assume the Communities for All Ages is going to be doing the same thing. So thank you for that information. Are there, yeah?
I definitely second what Dr. Potts has spoken about. I have been adamant about that situation for some time because I have an older brother who suffers from COPD and realize what it all entails. Secondly, I would like to add, and I notice you have it on 6E, you have information about locating a full-service grocery store in the area. I would like to see you eventually incorporate healthy eating through all of this. I am a grant writer. I work specifically for Shepherd Center of the Northland for this particular affiliation. And I also work with Truman Medical Center. Truman Medical Center has now the only traveling, so to speak, Healthy Harvest mobile market in the area that can take fresh fruits and vegetables very affordably to areas that are underserved. Beyond that, Truman Medical Center is establishing the first hospital-run grocery store in the nation, and that will be located at Spruce. And I am urging Shepherd Center to become affiliated with that because healthy eating is an utmost for seniors and their longevity.
Okay, thank you. Anything else? Any other questions about the checklist or how we're using it? And I'm going to talk at the end here for a couple minutes about where we're heading next, but if there's any other questions? Otherwise, are we ready to proceed to is there another slide here? Yeah. Well, first of all, I just want to thank all of you for coming and taking your time out, and particularly, because there's so many of you here, for all the time you've spent in helping us create this checklist. So I do want to close with some remarks about that, too often, oh, my apologies. Someone trying to call. Too often we viewed issues such as changing demographics as a problem, and we're kind of a problem we're kind of sort of reluctant to address. And but I think the Communities for All Ages initiative and the checklist sort of takes and changes changing demographics as an opportunity, something to be embraced. And if we do that, we'll come out with much better results. And so a couple people have asked me to sort of relate this story. So for about almost 25 years, I was director of development for the city of Kansas City, Kansas, right up to the time they consolidated and created the unified government there. And for a number of years in the 70s and 80s, we had a growing Hispanic population, especially in the Central Avenue area, if you're familiar with Kansas City, Kansas, and it was pretty much viewed as a problem, something we had to deal with, that we didn't really want to deal with, but we had to deal with. And it was sort of seen, there's going to be more crime, there's going to be more disinvestment in these older neighborhoods. There were a lot of language problems, so communication problems. And then, and I can't say that there was this big policy change where we said, okay, we're going to embrace this now, but gradually the community came to realize that there was a better way to deal with this and looked at it as more an opportunity. Okay, we have all these new people coming into our community. What if we embrace this, and how might that change things? And so we started to realize, well, there weren't just problems, there were benefits for what was happening. This new population of Hispanics were opening new businesses in areas where where there were vacant stores, where businesses have moved out. They started to invest in their neighborhoods, to renovate homes, to really create a community where a community was kind of seeping away, if you will. And the city increasingly reached out to this community. The police officers began to learn Spanish, and so they could communicate with the community. And eventually they were embraced as a part of that very diverse community. And it's made all the difference in the world, not only in the communication within the community, but how that's helped revitalize an important area of the community. And so we kind of see this issue along the same lines. While changing demographics, such as the increase in older adults we've talked about, bring new challenges, they also open up a lot of new opportunities. And we think the best way to approach this is to embrace this and look for those opportunities. So, as Frank mentioned, there's a lot of economic benefit in embracing the older adult population. We know the millennials are going to be generating the income coming forward, and so we want to embrace them as well. They're often potential source of volunteers and engagement. They're very active, as we found out in these focus groups. Everybody wanted to stay engaged in this issue, and so they're a really important resource. They're also very well educated, as we found out, and so that education's available to your community as well. And they often bring a focus on a community that benefits all age groups. So that's kind of our message with this, is this is a great opportunity, let's work together, and we hope the checklist will help you do that. Just want to say a couple things about our next steps. So as I mentioned, the First Suburbs Coalition is going to, first our planning work group and then the full coalition in September is going to consider this, and we'll consider some of these changes that have been suggested and recommending the checklist to the full coalition for their consideration to adopt it and recommend it out to their members and other communities. We're also going to consider the recognition program and what would that entail, not a full certification program, but a recognition program that the First Suburbs Coalition might sponsor, and what would that entail, and we might initiate that this fall. And then the Communities for All Ages, we're hoping to gain a third year of funding for this initiative, and so we'll be able to pursue other aspects, expand this work to other communities. We've had several other communities ask us about going through the process that the 4 test communities went through, and also look at things like the certification and how we might really embed this in the things we do every day, even when we don't have a foundation grant to help us do it. So again, I want to thank all of you. I want to especially thank again Julie and Kelly Reinhardt for all the work they put into this. They were really great to work with, and I know they worked with a lot of you in putting this together. And then a special thanks to Kathy Boyer-Sechel for really leading this effort and really making this a priority in our region, one of the few regions around the country that's now really recognized for the work they're doing in this area. And then finally, you have an evaluation at your place. If you would please take a couple minutes before you leave and fill out that evaluation, it really helps us hone these workshops, because you know Mark will have many more workshops that we'll be presenting and you'll be invited to. Helps us make them as useful as possible. So with that, we're adjourned. Thank you very much for your time, and we'll be keeping all of you apprised of what goes on as we move forward. Thanks a lot.